It's important that we ground ourselves in the acknowledgement that from wherever we are joining this meeting tonight, that for those of us who are non-Indigenous, we are settlers and we are guests on this land. The city in which many of you from Hamilton may stand tonight is situated upon the ancestral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Confederacy land, as determined by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. It also is the area with long-standing relationships with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Six Nations of the Grand River. All of us are somewhere on Turtle Island today. And if you know the traditional name of the territory in which you are located, by all means, you're welcome to enter that into our chat. For those of us in Halton, which is where I'm personally situated tonight, these are the lands of the Anishinaabe to the Wanderan, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis. And these lands are surrounding the Great Lakes and are steeped with Indigenous history. So we also acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation for being stewards of this territory. And we'd like to say that we are grateful to the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. We hold our hands up to their amazing resistance, resilience, and strength in the face of ongoing dispossession and colonial violence. And this topic tonight about income security is important for many reasons, but also so many Indigenous people continue to survive in poverty in this province, underscores our intention and our recognition that we do need to acknowledge the ground on which we are locating this meeting tonight. So to acknowledge these lands is to take a step in demonstrating our commitments to beginning the process of dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. May we bring the same commitment and spirit of truth-seeking and reconciliation to our conversation tonight, and so be it. Back to you, Deirdre.
Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you. I am grateful for you including all those various parts and people who are in different spots. As Jen said, feel free to follow a pattern to put that in the chat. And so thank you very much for being here tonight. Again, my name is Deirdre Pike and I'm a senior social planner with the Social Planning and Research Council of Hamilton. And to my right or left is Dan Deering. He's from Community Development Halton. Dan, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Deirdre. My name is Dan Deering. I'm the Research and Policy Analyst here at Community Development Halton. And for those that aren't aware of what CDH does, we are a three-pillar nonprofit supporting the entire Halton region. And we have a volunteer Halton department and age-friendly initiatives. And the third department is the area of social policy and planning, which is where I work. And I'd first begin by thanking the ongoing support that we receive from United Way, Halton and Hamilton, whose ongoing funding and generosity allows us to host such wonderful events this evening and support our wider programs and initiatives. And I'd also like to extend a warm thank you to not only everyone that's attending here tonight, our speakers, but also, like Deirdre said earlier, we are receiving some good media coverage around this. And I think it's beginning to resonate, the issues of income security resonating with a wider audience in our community here. So it's very timely and we're appreciative of everyone that's picking up on this. Yeah, so I'm just going to briefly speak about, before I hand it back to Deirdre, just to let everyone know here that we are going to follow up with not only the recording, but also we've put together a small little publication with some of the key themes that will be discussed tonight on minimum wages, childcare, sick pays, and basic income. And there'll be some further resources in there, some links to some of our partners and to some of the organizations that our speakers are coming from tonight. So do check out for that in the coming days, probably before the weekend. So if You know, if canvassers or candidates come to your door over the next couple of weeks, there will be some questions in that report that you can bring to them. So on to our first speaker, Pam Frache, who is an organizer with the Workers Action Centre and a coordinator with Justice for Workers campaign. In our publication that's going out before the weekend, we are going to reference some of the work that her organizations do, particularly the From the Front Lines, an urgent agenda for decent work report.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for giving me your time tonight. It's a real honor to be here, and actually I feel very excited to be here because we're in the midst of a very important election in this province. And I have to say, in my lifetime, I don't feel as though issues of income security have been as central on the agenda as we're experiencing now. And I think the fact that we've been through 2 years of horrific conditions under COVID that has really exposed the extent of poverty and inequality in this province, then I think I'm heartened by how many people really agree with us that it is absolutely intolerable. So the challenge, I think, for all of us is to spread the word and let people know that these issues are on the agenda in a serious way, because when I talk to people about what's on offer, people are very excited, but not everybody knows what's on offer. So I'm hopeful that this conversation can actually facilitate and indeed accelerate that conversation. And I know everybody here understands the importance of work in terms of income security, and just how much work, the kind of work that we have, structures everything about our lives. It structures where we live. It structures the kind of housing that we can afford. It structures whether or not we have access to medicine and to healthy food. Everything about work affects our lives, and everything about not having work or not being able to work affects our lives. So it's absolutely a fundamental question, and it's not merely a fundamental question. I would go so far as to say it's a question of racial justice, it's a question of gender justice, and a question of disability justice as well. Because we know that because of racism, and let's be really honest, because of racism in the labor market, Black workers, Indigenous workers, workers of color, and non-white workers of color are forced into the worst jobs with the least pay, the fewest benefits, and very often they're forced into part-time work involuntarily. And that's why we really see the fight for decent work as a matter of racial justice and a matter of gender justice as well, because it's not always as simple as a man and woman walk into employment office and they both get the same job and one gets paid less than the other. It's not always that simple. It's the structural elements. It's the fact that women, by and large, shoulder the burden of childcare and family caring responsibilities, which means they more often choose part-time in order to balance those obligations and responsibilities. And then, of course, when we start to look at what happens with part-time work, we know that it's legal to pay part-time workers less than their full-time counterparts. It's legal to deny paid sick days to part-time workers, even if full-time workers have it. And just on a pause, I just want to say it blew my mind during the pandemic to learn that frontline health workers did not have paid sick days, often because they were part-time, but often because it wasn't negotiated in their collective agreement, or they didn't have the coverage of a union. So that blew me away. I'm meeting nurses on the front lines of COVID who had no paid sick days. Just staggering. And we have a government that voted against permanent employer paid sick days 27 times in a global pandemic, while other jurisdictions around the world were stepping up and legislating that. Our government, not only did they begin their term by eliminating the 2 measly paid sick days that we had captured from the previous government, this government said no to that. And the current government also canceled the $15 minimum wage, which was supposed to come into effect on January 1st, 2018. And that meant this government sent workers into the pandemic with less wages and fewer workplace protections. They rolled back the whole gamut of what we had won under the previous government. And it is a scandal to my mind that, and I think we need to remind ourselves of that. So obviously the question of decent work is important. And I'll just quickly talk about our sort of 5 top issues in this election, although there's many more issues in this election, but I'll just stick to my lane, which is the decent work lane. So I just want to start off by talking about the $20 minimum wage. And I have to say, it's not always the case that political parties feel confident to have a bold agenda for decent work. And that is also my lived experience. So I'm really happy to say that we have a bold agenda for decent work on the table. We have, the NDP was the first party to come out clearly and say they support $20 minimum wage. They're going to implement it by immediately increasing the minimum wage by $1 and then $1 every year until it's 20. And of course, they'll index to inflation, and then there will be an evaluation about that. Subsequent to that, the Green Party has come on board. But I want to pause because what the Liberals are saying on this matter is the Liberals are saying they'll bump the minimum wage to $16 an hour, and then they're going to have consultations on regional living wage rates. And this may be a little controversial for this audience, but I would be remiss if I didn't share with you my concerns about this, because we talk about racism in the labor market. Racism shapes where we even get to live. And very often people who work in Toronto are forced to move to lower cost regions in order to make ends meet. And the real risk of having regional wages where some regions are paid less than other regions is that we are going to entrench structural racism because of the racialized aspect of who is forced to live where because of the nature of work. So we feel like it's very, very important that we adhere to the principle of equal pay for equal work, and that if we fight together to raise the floor of wages and working conditions for all of us, it means that we can not only raise the floor and take care of each other, but it means that we're going to be stronger and united, and we'll be able to fight for more and better things for all of us. So we really do want to get away from the poverty by postal code tendency that the regional living wage methodology leads us into. And I know that the intention is to raise the bar on, and make us dream bigger about not just having a minimum wage, but let's have a healthy wage. And I couldn't agree with that sentiment more. But the difficulty with the way that the living wage rates are calculated is that it pits household expenses and social programs against our direct wages. And I want to briefly unpack this. For example, we are so happy, and Carolyn is going to talk more about this, about getting the $10 a day childcare, which is very good. But of course, workers need to be in the mix here. And Carolyn will elaborate more on that. And workers are always the invisible aspect of all of these things. We're going to do these great things, but we're not going to look after the workers at all. But let's just say we have $10 a day childcare. That is going to have the effect of dramatically reducing household expenses, which is going to have the effect of reducing the wages required to pay for those household expenses. And as a consequence, there's an unintended consequence of pitting our social programs against our direct wages. We want strong childcare and good wages. And if we got universal transportation, that would also further reduce household expenses. But we welcome that, and we want that, and we also want higher wages. And the way we like to think of it is that the social programs are like our social wage, and the wages we get from our employer is like our direct wage. And we want those things to be in sync, and we see them as both our wages, and we want higher wages for all of us. So we don't want to counterpose those things, and we want a united fight, because we're going to need it to get the minimum wage up to 20, because we learned the hard way in the last government that if we don't have everyone fighting on the same front, we are going to lose it. And I will just say in my own life experience, to win something as important as a path to a $15 minimum wage and having it taken away, it's a real learning experience about going through that. And it was a good reminder for me that we need to be stronger and more united, no matter who gets elected on June 2nd, because even if our friends get elected, the corporations are going to come at them with a vengeance. And so we need to be strong and in fighting form to be able to defend their agenda and keep it moving forward. So I did want to say just a word on that. I wanted to briefly touch on the question of paid sick days. I'm sure there's no argument here, but there's we were able to force the Ford government to move on temporary paid sick days, but of course that's not good enough. And I really think that it's time that we implement 10 permanent employer paid sick days for all of us. And 70% of frontline minimum wage earners do not have paid sick days. And when we think about the racialized aspect of this, again, we can safely say that it's more likely for white people to have paid sick days than it is for workers of color, for Black workers, Indigenous workers, and so forth. So we have to say that this is not about giving paid sick days to workers. This is about making sure there's equal access to paid sick days. And that's why we need a law for that. And that's why it's absolutely essential that we vote for the parties that are putting the $20 minimum wage clearly on the agenda, 10 paid sick days clearly on the agenda, and the business of equal pay for part-time contract and temp agency workers. As long as there's an incentive for an employer to hire cheap labor instead of full-time good jobs with benefits, they will do that. Why would you not? You'd get, if you can get 2 workers for cheaper than the price of 1, why on earth would anyone do that? And don't let them tell you that small businesses object to any of these policies. In fact, small businesses already know that and already pay usually good wages, paid sick days, the whole shebang. What they have to compete with are the big box stores and the Amazons, the Walmarts, the Loblaws that don't give a darn about their workforce, and yet they're out there, parading around as if they can't afford to do a single solitary thing when we know they all increased their wealth over COVID. The small businesses are the ones that support these measures, and making laws actually levels the playing field and makes it more fair for small businesses to compete. So the equal pay, the 10 paid sick days, very important. Again, the NDP, I will say in this round, has been leading on this, and we've been very, very happy. In fact, the NDP was the first bill to table our call for the 10 paid sick days plus the additional automatic 2 weeks during a pandemic. And that's for union and non-union workers as well, because we know that frontline health workers, for example, who have to isolate when they're exposed to the flu, use up their paid sick days very, very quickly. And so many frontline workers, even when they had paid sick days in their collective agreement, had exhausted them by the time COVID came along. So we think this is very important. The NDP has led on this, and they actually got agreement with the Liberals and the NDP, and that is absolutely fantastic. I'll quickly end on two very important points. Misclassification, some of you may have heard about it. This is when companies like Uber and DoorDash deliberately say, oh, we don't have workers, we just have a fleet of independent contractors, entrepreneurs, if you will. And those corporations not only deny rights and benefits to their employees, but they actually wiggle out of basic payroll taxes. Like they don't pay into CPP, Canada Pension Plan. They don't pay into employment insurance. They have no obligation to workers. They don't have to pay into workers' comp, none of those things. So it's another cheap labor strategy that makes me sick. And we know all around the world, gig workers and other misclassified workers are fighting back and getting recognized as full employees as they are. The parting shot of this government was to introduce legislation to deny gig workers their full rights under the law. And we need a government elected that is going to repeal that legislation and make sure that workers are fully protected under the law. And it's not just gig workers, it's truck drivers, it's security guards, childcare workers, all sorts of people are misclassified. And finally, just cause protection. That sounds like fancy language, but it's basically saying, like, and some of you may be surprised to learn this. I was very surprised to learn this, that under the laws, the employer doesn't have to give a reason for firing you. They can wake up one day and say, I don't like your hairdo, I don't like your shirt, and you're gone. The only obligation under the Employment Standards Act is to give you adequate notice. And if they can't give you adequate notice, they have to pay you instead of the notice. That's it. So we need a process by which employers cannot fire workers arbitrarily. It's also a matter of racial and gender justice and anyone who faces discrimination in the labor market, because people who are subject to discrimination are also more at risk in the workplace, full stop. If you're trying to build a union, you're at risk. So all of these things are very important. I'm going to do a very quick screen share now to just let you know we have a tool Actually, you'll let me, should make me a co-host and allow me to share my screen. I'll give you our election toolkit. And I'll also paste the links in the chat, and I'll just very quickly wrap up because I know my time is up. So I'm going to share my screen quickly. I hope you find this as useful as I certainly have, and others that we've been speaking about. So these are our general campaign demands, but this is a chart on where the parties stand. And I'll just say two things really quickly. I am happy in this election that the Green Party changed its position to not advance the regional wage policy that it had initially adopted, and it changed its mind, and it came on board with many of these other positions after it released its platform. So we're very happy about that. And we're very happy that the NDP changed its position on social assistance and Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support. It was completely inadequate what they put forward. And now both the NDP and the Green Party are saying doubling of it. Tom will talk more about that, but to me, that's an exciting development. That tells me that the movements are thriving, that politicians are hearing the message, and that means all the work that all of you have been doing has been absolutely phenomenal. The real question for us now, we have 2 weeks left. We got to get out the vote, and we got to talk to people who don't know that all of this good stuff is on the agenda. And let's make sure we get everybody out to vote, get those organizing conversations going, and let's come out of the election stronger than we've ever been, because no matter who gets elected, we're going to need all the fighters we got. And that's it. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. I put a couple of links from your websites in the chat there, but not that particular document, Pam. If you could copy that. Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much.
How do I follow that up though? That was amazing.
Tom Cooper, I think, well, I would just tell you, you may not know, he is the director of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, about a decade or so, I think. A little bit of experience there, and I'm going to put some more stuff about him in the chat. But he's going to be here now to speak to us about social assistance, basic income, and some of those other tools. Anyway, take it away, Tom. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Deirdre, and thanks, Pam, for that. As Pam mentioned, for the first time, I can remember the inadequacy of social assistance rates actually has become an election issue. And it's about bloody time. For more than 25 years, income security for Ontario's most vulnerable people has often been an afterthought during elections. So people have fallen further and further and further behind. And today, the opposition parties are committing at least to important, if not always livable, social assistance rates. Even the government, the Conservatives, which has kept social assistance rates frozen for the last 4 years, has found religion, and they've committed to a paltry 5% increase for social assistance. But as a note of caution, the last time we had a provincial election, I remember clearly the current government party promising something regarding income security, and that was to keep the Ontario Basic Income Pilot up and running, and to learn about that progressive income security experiment and to see what the outcomes would be and do an evaluation. But as many of you will know, shortly after the election, the newly appointed Minister of Children, Community and Social Services, Lisa MacLeod, held a media conference to announce the government was canceling the basic income pilot. And that decision to end it 2 years early before the government received an evaluation was absolutely devastating. It was devastating for the 1,000 participants here in Hamilton, and it threw their lives into chaos. More than 1,000 Hamiltonians, 3,000 others in Lindsay and Thunder Bay, many of whom who had experienced and lived in deep poverty for decades, were bravely testing out that idea of basic income. Many had made plans. Early indications showed that participants were stabilizing their housing, they were eating better, they were feeling healthier, and re-engaging in the community. What's more, a report from McMaster University conducted after the pilot ended showed those on the pilot were seeking and getting better jobs. But again, those dreams were crushed. And a lot of airtime and reports, and even an excellent book by our friends Elaine Power and Jamie Swift have been dedicated to the cruel cancellation of the basic income pilot. But it was another announcement that was made that day that isn't as keenly remembered. And that was to slash a planned 3% increase to social assistance rates by half. And that day in July 31st, actually, 2018, was the last time social assistance rates were increased by this government. So it's been 4 years. The brave souls testing out basic income represented only a tiny fraction of people experiencing poverty in Ontario. There's almost 900,000 people in Ontario who continue to languish on general welfare or the Ontario Disability Support Program. We're now 4 years, 4 budgets later, and social assistance rates are still frozen in time. In the early days of the pandemic, 7 million Canadians benefited from a $2,000 a month Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, what we called CERB. Yet people on Ontario Works and were forced to subsist on just $733 a month during the most significant public health crisis of our lifetime. Rates for Ontario Works and ODSP have been woefully inadequate for years, ever since former Premier Mike Harris took a wrecking ball to the provincial social assistance supports in 1996. But as hard as it is to believe, social assistance recipients are much worse off today than they were even under the Harris regime. Social assistance rates have never added up. That's because there's never been a mechanism to determine adequacy based on the actual cost of things like housing and food, hygiene supplies, and other essentials. So in 1996, welfare rates fell from $663 a month to $520 a month overnight, and it stayed there for years. Before the cuts, a bachelor apartment here in Hamilton rented for $396 a month. So a single person on welfare theoretically could rent a bachelor apartment for 60% of what they received in benefits. Today, it is nearly impossible for somebody on social assistance to cover rent. According to Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and that is a very conservative estimate, that same bachelor apartment in Hamilton today rents for over $900 a month. And so that's 122% of what somebody on Ontario Works gets monthly. And that's the lowest, most modest rental accommodation available to people. And we've seen the impact. We've seen economic evictions in staggering numbers, growing homelessness, tent encampments popping up across the city, across the province. But it's true when it comes to food as well, and being able to ensure that people on social assistance have an adequate diet. Food prices have doubled in the last 25 years. A pack of wieners sold for $2.29 in 1995. Today, that same package costs $4.96, 117% increase. Eggs that sold for $1.62 in 1995 now go for an average of $3.91, 141% increase. Vegetables such as carrots sold for $1.14 and currently cost $2.37. Again, over 100% increase. In those same 25 years, Ontario Works rates have risen by only 11%, about 1/5 of the rate of inflation. And we know what inflation is doing today, highest level in 3 decades. Today, Hamilton Food Share tells us that 3 out of 4 people visiting food banks are actually on either Ontario Works or ODSP. The government has, in essence, institutionalized hunger through its refusal to fix social assistance. So we can't just respond to policies that leave people in deep poverty through charity. We need to change the policies. The government needs to fulfill its responsibilities to Ontario's most vulnerable and provide an adequate and dignified standard of living, because everybody deserves opportunity, deserves dignity, and deserves a future. But I'm becoming more and more convinced that Ontario's social assistance system is broken beyond repair. I think we need a new, bold solution for the 21st century. And that solution, in my opinion, is universal basic income. As I mentioned off the top, we tested the idea of basic income here in Hamilton, and I really do think it works. Everybody who participated in the Ontario Basic Income Pilot had a story to tell about eating better, about purchasing warmer clothes, about the opportunities to live in dignity, go back to school, and not rely on handouts or donations to survive. I personally wasn't always convinced that basic income was the right direction or the appropriate policy intervention to resolve social ills. But for 18 months, we had the opportunity to see it in action. There are dozens of other experiments around the world taking place right now. In the United States, particularly, a progressive group of often racialized mayors have launched local basic income experiments. And they're targeted towards sometimes artists, sometimes people experiencing homelessness. And to a pilot, those are having outstanding results and really enabling people to restore those opportunities that have been lost from experiencing poverty. So shortly after the Ontario government canned the Ontario pilot and actually fired not only the evaluators, but also the ethical review team that was supposed to protect those people participating in the pilot, we thought it would be really, really important to try to gather as much information. So thanks to an amazing team at McMaster University led by Dr. Wayne Luchek and Dr. Stephanie Ross, they engaged more than 200 local basic income pilot participants. And those individuals were happy to come forward and share their stories. And they told stories about how they were getting better jobs, about how their health had improved, how they were eating better. People who were on basic income, believe it or not, also were drinking less and smoking less because it had restored a sense of hope and a sense of agency for people that they simply didn't have before. And so that's what I want to end with. I want to end with the idea of looking at basic income as a policy alternative. We have a number of parties, the opposition parties, the Liberals, the NDP, the Greens, who like the idea of basic income. Two of those parties, the Liberals and the NDP, want to bring back the Ontario pilot and do a little bit of experimenting again. We don't have details yet on whether it'll be a revisiting of the previous pilot or who will be involved or where it will take place. But I really do think we need to be cautious. Despite the very public debate about early cancellation of the pilot, and there was a legal case, there was a class action lawsuit launched by the pilot participants themselves. We haven't really talked in this province about our obligation to human beings in experiments of this kind, in income security experiments. The use of human participants in social science experiments hasn't been well documented. And this is true of the substantially higher incomes that are used as treatments in these types of research studies. We're currently in the process of reviewing ethical standards and practices in Canada, but we have to be very careful because the people who were involved in the Ontario Basic Income pilot were shown a ray of hope and then had that taken away from them by the government. And that caused incredible harm. And we can certainly name many of our friends who were harmed and sadly who are no longer with us as a result of that cruel cancellation. I think of Michael Hampson, who died just prior to the pandemic. And Michael often talked about how the basic income pilot had restored his sense of hope that we could all live in dignity. But in the case of basic income pilots, we need to ensure that consent is real and people know what they're signing up for. My friend Laura Katari, who works with me at the Roundtable, has said that the previous pilot failed on those counts. Its description did not clearly state a start and end date for participants. It had political biases and the early cancellation simply wasn't foreseeable for us. I remember Deirdre and I, talking to many potential participants, and we felt confident because we had the assurance from the government at the time that this pilot was going to go for the full 3 years. And then during the election, all 3 political parties committed to keep it going. But that's where we have to be careful, because we need to ensure there are airtight protections for people if these types of pilots are to come into being after the election. I would much rather see a commitment to move forward on basic income. We know it works. We know the results have been outstanding. We've experimented with it enough. Certainly not only in Manitoba in the 1970s, here in Ontario from 2017 to 2019, but even the impact of CERB, I think, proved that this type of income security transfer can be absolutely transformational for people to move them out of poverty. And I really do think it will be the most important public policy intervention of the 21st century. So I'll end with that, Deirdre, and certainly happy to talk about this a little bit more in the breakout rooms. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks very much, Tom. And I'm going to bring Dan back up to introduce our next speaker.
Excellent. Thanks, Deirdre. So our final speaker before the breakout rooms, Carolyn Ferns, who is a public policy coordinator with Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare. And she and her organization are doing excellent work around advocating for improved working conditions for childcare professionals. So without further ado, over to you, Carolyn. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thanks everyone for having me this evening. And this is such an interesting and important discussion to be having right now in the middle of this provincial election. And one of the things that I want to start with as we start to talk about childcare is a question that a journalist asked me recently, which is childcare even an issue in this provincial election? Because we know we now have the federal childcare plan, right, which advocates have been calling for. It was a 50-year struggle to get the federal government engaged on childcare the way that they are now. And the Ontario government has now signed on to the federal childcare plan. And so we're going to see billions of dollars going to improve childcare to make it more affordable for families. So is childcare an issue in the provincial election? And my answer to that, and the case that I'll make to you this evening, is that it absolutely is. And the question is, the ballot box question when it comes to childcare is, who do you trust to carry through the Canada-wide childcare plan here in Ontario, based on the record that we've seen over the last 4 years? And I'm just going to start, and I can share my screen because I was reflecting on this and thinking about the last 4 years, going back to June of 2018. And this first slide, if you can see it, is a picture of yours truly with my son at the time, an infant, now in kindergarten, on the day after the election, when I wrote to childcare advocates and supporters across Ontario and told them, are you feeling blue about childcare? Because if we rewind the clock to 2018, just to remind folks that we were in a position here in the province of Ontario where we had free preschool childcare about to roll out across the province. A plan that the childcare community had worked on, that childcare advocates and experts like Dr. Gordon Cleveland had written reports on, to get this plan into place. And in 2018, the election of the Ford Conservatives meant that plan, along with a workforce strategy, which would have brought in a salary scale and decent work for early childhood educators, were scrapped and never to be re-implemented again. And that started off, 4 years of resistance and struggle to keep childcare on the agenda, to keep talking about the need for childcare for families in this province, and for decent work and pay for educators. And if we move to the next slide, in 2019, the Ontario budget of the Ford government proposed cuts of more than $80 million to childcare across this province. And this then engaged municipalities, childcare advocates, families, educators in a huge campaign of resistance to these cuts, which ultimately saw the Ford government back off after what I'd say was unprecedented resistance from communities on this. But again, something where we were fighting just to maintain what we had worked for years to build in terms of access to childcare for families. And then in 2020, we saw sneaky changes of deregulation attempts by the provincial government to increase ratios and group sizes in childcare to lower the quality of childcare for our kids. And then again, during the pandemic, my favorite, the nice ladies of childcare, furious at the lack of lead time and financial support in daycare reopening, where childcare was time after time forgotten, and childcare workers forgotten on the front line, workers who were really helping keeping the economy afloat, and seemed to be dead last when it came to the provincial government's priorities. So, you know, the fact that we are now in a position where we have actually billions of dollars of funding on the table to flow to childcare is thanks to communities, childcare advocates who engaged the provincial government finally at the last hour to sign on to an agreement which was going to be providing them with billions of dollars of federal government funding to childcare. But the question that I would think of is, given that record, do we think that they'll follow through? And that's a question that I want people to reflect on as they go to the ballot box in June. Now, what's interesting and important to think about is what the pandemic has done in terms of our understanding of childcare, and how many more people are engaged now in the struggle for decent childcare, affordable childcare for families, and decent work for educators than were before. Because for years, we've had an invisible crisis when it comes to childcare, and that invisible crisis has been kept invisible because families, especially mothers and early childhood educators and childcare workers, work underneath. It's like people treading water, under the water, you know, trying to cobble together childcare arrangements, pay completely unaffordable fees, and then childcare workers keeping things together, keeping the doors of childcare centers open, basically subsidizing childcare with their low wages. And this has been an invisible crisis for years, but the pandemic suddenly made this crisis visible to many more people, especially to employers. Because any employer with a parent on a Zoom screen who had a toddler crawling in their head knew we had a childcare crisis. Any supermarket manager who couldn't staff their shift because childcare programs were closed during the pandemic knew that we had a childcare crisis. And so many more people became engaged. But what failed to happen was the provincial government really hasn't changed their thinking on childcare. And the fact that they've been dragged to the negotiating table and signed doesn't change the way they see this issue. If we move from those headlines from the over the last 4 years to a headline from today, we can see that, let me pull up the screen, a Canadian Press story today that says that Ontario childcare rebates were supposed to begin in May, and that may not happen. Because when that childcare agreement was signed on March 27th, the deadline of March 31st, Premier Ford got up there in front of the cameras and told parents that childcare rebates would start in May. And that was on March 27th, expecting that within a month, funding would be flowing to municipalities and that childcare operators would have this process in place to opt into a whole new funding system. Well, guess what? Everybody who heard that knew that was never going to happen. That was not realistic. And it was a promise made and a promise broken, because here we are, May 18th, and not a single childcare center in Ontario is yet opted into this system, because of course it's just coming online now. It's, the process for programs to opt in is only just being set up. And while childcare advocates were warning the provincial government month upon month that, they should sign on and they should do it quickly, this is exactly why, because it's going to be the fall or maybe the winter before parents see reductions in their childcare fees. And of course, that means for families that are struggling to pay for childcare, that families are struggling with inflation and housing costs, this is completely unmanageable for them. Meanwhile, provinces like British Columbia, which signed on to the childcare plan last July, families there are already benefiting, partly because yes, their provincial government signed months earlier than ours did, but also because that provincial government signed the agreement with a plan to put it into place. Whereas our provincial government signed the agreement at the last minute, had a secret action plan that they didn't share with anybody, that they never consulted municipalities or operators on, and then expect everybody to turn around and scramble and get this out the door within a month. So I think that it's a promise made and a promise broken by Premier Ford back there on March 27th. So the question as to whether childcare is an election issue in 2022, I think it absolutely is. And I think we have to think what government will take this on responsibly, will not only reduce childcare fees for families, but the biggest and most burning issue and challenge for any government in moving this forward is, how do you solve the childcare workforce crisis? Because for years we've had a recruitment and retention crisis in childcare driven by the low wages and lack of decent working conditions for childcare workers. And during the pandemic, that's become so much worse, to the point that now we hear stories across the province of childcare programs closing rooms, limiting enrollment, not because they don't have the space, but because they do not have the childcare workers to staff those programs. And the current agreement with the provincial government, the province's current action plan, only puts 3% of the billions of dollars going to childcare to improve the wages of early childhood educators. Again, a provincial government that canceled a workforce strategy for childcare back in 2018 that would have seen a salary scale by now being implemented. So we know that every other party has committed to a workforce strategy for childcare that would put childcare workers more on par with folks in public education. And so, it's something that we need to have, candidates speaking to what their plan is to solve the workforce crisis, because, programs and parties have said that they want to expand childcare spaces, but if we can't staff the programs we have now, how are we going to staff, spaces, 86,000 new spaces that the provincial government says that they're going to create? So on that issue, I'm just going to share a link in the chat to an email your candidates tool, which we're just putting up. This is, I think there's only 10 people who've signed it because it's only just launched like an hour ago and we've just tested it out. But folks can sign on to send an email to your local candidates asking them to pledge their support for childcare, especially for childcare workers, because we know that to have accessible childcare for families, you need to have the early childhood educators. Otherwise, it's just 4 walls and some toys. It's not childcare. And so the interests of families and the interests of early childhood educators on this are completely aligned. So thank you everybody for coming this evening. And I hope that I've made the case that childcare is the ballot box issue in this election. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's certainly some feedback in the chat room that says that that's the case. And I'm so glad that we'll be able to share that new link that you've put in there, this new campaign. And I just want people to know that we are collecting all the links that are in the chat tonight, and they'll be part of the communication you'll get. So there's 40 of us here tonight, and we're going to have 4 breakout rooms now, so that we can dig in a little bit into these conversations. All right, so Pam, any follow-up closing comments, a little bit of feedback? What did you hear in your group?
Well, we had some great questions, actually. People wanted to talk a little bit more about the relationship between social programs and the direct wages, and how, and so we just unpacked a little bit about the living wage methodology that inadvertently means that when we get a win on social programs, it has the unintended consequence of reducing the living wage required to fund that basket of household expenses. So we talked a little bit about that. We had a question about the relationship between the Fight for 15 and fairness and the justice for workers. And we talked about how workers themselves have been choosing the demands, but that by the time we launched Fight for 15 and fairness back in April 2015, and by the time we actually won a $15 minimum wage, which didn't come into being on schedule, it was quite dated. And so before the pandemic, we had a big consultation, and we asked hundreds of workers who are in low wage and precarious employment what they want to fight for. If, you know, do they want to fight for even to raise the minimum wage? And they identified the priorities, the $20, the 10 paid sick days, and so forth. So our demands are on the website. And we also had a question about why are we hearing from in the election different minimum wage is of $16 versus $20. And I was just saying, I was surprised that the Liberals are only offering $16 plus consultation, when under their own policy, because it was the Liberals that gave us a path to 15, next October 1st, the minimum wage would be well over $16 as of October 1st. So I was surprised at that step back on that front. So that's why, so that's basically what the different political parties are offering. And that was about it. And here we are. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. So important. Yeah. All right. So what about Tom?
What about Tom? We had a really great discussion. A couple themes emerged for me. And if Sarah's around, I mentioned a report she did a couple of years ago comparing the landlord-tenant legislation in Quebec compared to Ontario. And you know, it's great to have to dream about a basic income, but unless you have the ability to protect the right to housing and real rent control legislation, it's going to be for naught. So that was something that was brought up, and I think is really important to build into the equation around income security. Is that right to housing? Is the importance of legislation that protects the most vulnerable tenants? The other thing we talked about, Peggy and others mentioned, was the additional costs of living with a disability. And we already mentioned her name a couple times tonight, but my colleague Laura Katari last year actually did a report on the financial costs of disability. I didn't mention in my presentation that the basic income pilot also included an additional supplement for people with disabilities of $500 a month, but we do recognize that living with a disability adds enormous extra costs to your life. So that is something we should always take into consideration when talking about these income security programs. So maybe I'll end with that, Deirdre.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for everything tonight. And it really highlights a lot. Again, we'll have links to those sorts of issues in our handout. And finally, well, not finally, but our final guest speaker for tonight was Carolyn.
We had a good discussion, and it's great to see. I know Hamilton has so many good local childcare advocates, and some of them were in the room there as part of the discussion. So one of the things that came up was Judith was talking about how Hamilton is really a childcare desert here in Ontario, and that is behind in terms of the number of childcare spaces available to families behind most other cities in the province. And so talking about that expansion and how important that's going to be to ensure that we don't just have new spaces, and it's not just ad hoc or wherever they seem to pop up, but to make sure that there actually is a planning process to make sure that those centers and spaces are where they're needed most. And then Andrea was talking about, of course it's great to build spaces, but the huge challenge of the workforce. We talked about some more around that, how important it is to have decent work and pay for early childhood educators and childcare workers to help solve that workforce crisis. So on that note, I'll just share the link again to our e-action, where you can email your candidates and tell them that we need to solve the workforce crisis in childcare, because it's the biggest issue that's going to be a real choke point in terms of getting this program off the ground. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. And once again, all those links will be available for you. So don't be panicking if you didn't get them all copied down or anything like that. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for joining us tonight. That was a really great presentation. And I'll invite Dan to come on back up. There you go.
Thanks, Deirdre. I'll just be very brief. We touched on a number of issues that came from the content from the three speakers, but the main bulk of the conversation, we spoke about insecure housing and how without having affordable access to housing, everything else is kind of almost meaningless, right? And Norma brought up how we need to have innovations around housing and look beyond Canada for how other countries are doing housing right. So yeah, I'll leave it on that.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that. This is our fourth town hall that the Social Planning and Research Council of Hamilton and Community Development Halton have done together. Thanks, Pam, for the applause and others there. And we did one on affordable housing. That was our first one. And then the last one was 50 ways to close a food bank, a conversation about food security. And then in between there, we had the federal election. And so we had a similar thing to this. And so this, our plan was to have 4, but we keep seeming to get a good vibe around these events. I think this conversation is going to be important, as Pam said, after the election. How are we going to, make sure, well, and each of the speakers, how are we going to make sure that these promises really are held? Thank each of you contributed tonight in a very special way. This will be shared with the 50 other people who did sign up for tonight, as many people do, and I think it's a good thing. Even when you can't make these important events, you sign up and watch it later, and so you'll have that link as well to share with others. So that's all we have for tonight. Dan, I want to thank you very much for co-hosting with me, and thank each of you
everyone.
again. And
thanks, Deirdre.
Yeah, safe trip home.